They buckled a dog collar around my neck, right there at the dinner table, and laughter burst around me like glass breaking, shrill and sharp and endless, while someone, I believe it was my daughter-in-law, though others were joining in, said the Ake, words I will never forget. Now she belongs. I sat there with my hands folded on my lap, as if I were waiting for permission to exist, while every eye in that room looked at me not as a mother or a grandmother or even a guest, but as an object. A strange accessory to their celebration. A mascot who could be mocked openly because who would defend me? Who would stop it? Who would even think it cruel when it was dressed in the clothes of a joke? I am 81 years old, and I live now in a modest flat above a bakery, where the smell of yeast and sugar rises every morning before dawn, and where no one tells me when to speak or where to sit or what to wear. But on that night, when the buckle clicked behind my neck and the leather pressed against the thin skin of my throat, I remembered what it felt like to be erased in full view of others, and told that erasure was amusement, that silence was good manners, that endurance was the only role left to me. It was supposed to be a party for my son's promotion, a glittering evening with catered food and polished glasses and neighbors coming through the door with their curated smiles. But for me it became a stage on which the role had been written in advance. The aging woman whose presence is tolerated only as long as she can be ridiculed. The dependent relative dressed in ridicule instead of dignity. I wore the dress I had ironed that morning with slow, careful hands, a navy fabric that had seen better days but still carried a trace of formality because I wanted to show respect, not just for the occasion but for myself. I pinned my hair the way I used to when my husband was alive, brushed a hint of powder over the sallow skin, even chose earrings that sparkled faintly in the light, and as I looked in the mirror before leaving my small rented room, I thought, not without some pride, that I had managed to preserve a little of the woman I once was, the woman who cooked holiday meals for 20 people without flinching, who balanced ledgers, who signed checks, who knew exactly where every bill was paid from and why. Yet none of that mattered once I stepped through the door of their house and felt the eyes measuring me, dismissing me, assigning me a role that had nothing to do with my history or my labor or my sacrifices. At first it was subtle, the way cruelty often is when it wants to parade as sophistication. They poured drinks for one another in tall crystal flutes and handed me a plastic tumbler filled halfway with cheap white wine, though I had brought with me a bottle from my own cupboard, a bottle I had saved for years, and I had thought it might please them. They sat me near the children, though I had asked quietly if I might be closer to the center where conversation was easier to hear. When I tried to tell a story, nothing long, nothing indulgent, just a memory about my son as a boy, the words were smothered by louder voices, quick jokes, deliberate interruptions. I felt myself shrinking, like a garment washed too many times, threads unraveling in the bright light of other people's ease. But still I stayed. Still I smiled, because I told myself that belonging sometimes required patience, that maybe I was being too sensitive, that perhaps the tide of conversation would turn and someone would see me as more than furniture. It did not. Instead, when the speeches began, when my son was toasted and his wife preened beside him as if his achievement were hers to wear, they decided, without warning, without hesitation, that the entertainment would be me. The collar was brought out from somewhere, perhaps a drawer or a box wrapped like a gag gift, and before I could register what it was around my neck, the buckle fastening with a finality that startled me. There was laughter, first hesitant, then emboldened, the kind of laughter that feeds on itself until it becomes a wave crashing against the walls, and I heard the words, "Now she belongs. Now she's ours." I sat very still, not daring to lift a hand to my throat, not daring to show that the leather was warm and smelled faintly of sweat, that it pressed against the hollow where my pulse beat. I thought for a moment of dogs I had owned long ago, loyal creatures who waited by the door for me to return, and I wondered if this was how they imagined me now. A dependent animal whose loyalty was taken for granted and whose voice could be silenced with one tug of a leash. I do not remember eating after that, though food was served. I do not remember drinking, though glasses were refilled. What I remember is the sound. Laughter that seemed endless. Every chuckle another erasure. Every smile another nail in the coffin of dignity. My son's face I remember most vividly. Not because he was the loudest, but because he was the quietest. He sat there with a strained smile, a man who had once clung to my hand as a boy when crossing the street, who had wept when he failed his first exam, who had leaned on me when his father died. He did not laugh loudly, but neither did he stop them. He let it happen. He let his wife and her friends and their neighbors make me into an object, and in that letting, he betrayed me more than any stranger could. His silence was a wound I cannot close. Now, months later, in the flat above the bakery, when the sun comes through the small window and the scent of fresh bread rises like a hymn, I sometimes place my hand against my throat as if to feel whether the collar is still there, as if the skin remembers what the mind wants to forget. It is not the leather that lingers, but the certainty that I was no longer considered human in their eyes, that I was a prop in their performance of success, that the woman who once signed deeds and paid mortgages and balanced accounts had been rewritten as a clown, a pet, a creature they could mock without consequence. And yet even that night, even as the buckle pressed against me, there was another truth stirring quietly, almost invisibly, beneath the humiliation. The knowledge that I still held something they feared, something they hoped I had forgotten, something they never expected me to remember. I said nothing then. I sat through their laughter. But inside, I was holding a different kind of silence, one that would one day speak, one that would turn their performance to ash. So that is where my story begins, not with a birth or a wedding or a celebration, but with the moment I realized that they had erased me in public and thought it was funny, that they had reduced me to a pet and thought it was clever, that they had silenced me with a collar and thought it was safe. It begins there, at that table, under the bright light, with the smell of overcooked meat and perfume, with the sound of glass clinking and laughter swelling, with the feel of leather tight against my neck, with the taste of nothing on my tongue. It begins there, because that was the moment I understood that invisibility is not passive, that it is imposed, and that if I did not resist, if I did not act, I would spend the remainder of my days collared in their laughter. I am 81 years old, and I will not die wearing their leash. I did not speak of it that night, not when the laughter finally subsided into the clinking of forks against porcelain and the scraping of chairs as people stood to refill their glasses, not when my son kissed his wife on the cheek and accepted congratulations as though nothing unusual had happened, not when the collar was removed with an offhand gesture as if it had been no more consequential than a paper crown at a children's party, not even when I was shown to the small guest room at the far end of the hall where the sheets smelled faintly of starch and detergent, not of home. I lay down that night with the weight of humiliation pressing against my chest, and I told myself that silence was survival, that there would be no dignity in pleading, that they would not understand if I tried to name the cruelty, that they would only laugh again and tell me I had no sense of humor, that old people always take things too seriously. But in that silence, a harder truth was forming, one that had been building quietly for years, and which, in the aftermath of that single evening, took on the clarity of a blade held against light. They believed I had nothing, that I was nothing, that everything I had given and built and sacrificed had dissolved into thin air the moment I stopped being useful, the moment I could no longer host their holidays, or pay their bills, or keep my tongue between my teeth when they made decisions that cut me out of my own life. The catalyst did not arrive as a shout or a confrontation, but as a whisper of memory, the recollection of a morning many years ago when I stood in a lawyer's office with a pen in my hand, my son beside me, begging for help to secure a loan, to buy the very house where he now laughed while a collar pressed against my neck. He had been young then, full of dreams but empty of credit, drowning in debts that I had helped him conceal from his new bride, and he had said, "Mom, it's just a formality, just a signature. You'll still have security, but without you there is no deal." And I had believed him, as I always believed him, because a mother does not weigh her child's request like a banker. She signs where the line demands. She empties her savings. She puts her faith in the idea that gratitude is permanent. I had written my name, not only on the deed, but on the future of that house, and though they had long since stopped mentioning it, though they treated me now as if I were a visitor dependent on their charity, the truth was that the ground beneath their feet bore my signature. That night, after the humiliation, I could not sleep, and so I opened my small travel bag, where I keep the things they have always forgotten I possess. Among the folded sweaters and the worn slippers was a brown envelope, its corners softened by time, but its contents unaltered. Legal papers that bore witness to the reality they had worked so hard to bury. I unfolded them with trembling hands, and as I looked at the neat print of my own name on those pages, I felt the sting of humiliation give way to something colder, heavier, but steadier. The knowledge that I was not powerless, that they had mistaken endurance for emptiness, that their cruel laughter had been built on a false foundation, because the very walls that echoed their scorn belonged not to them but to me. The true catalyst was not the collar itself, nor the laughter, nor even my son's failure to intervene. It was the recognition, in that quiet room with the lamp casting a small yellow glow, that the story they told about me, that I was dependent, that I was an old woman being kept out of kindness, that I should be grateful for a seat at their table no matter how humiliating, was a fabrication, and that I held the documents that could unravel it. They believed I had nothing left but memories and fading photographs, but I had paper, stamped and signed, with the weight of law behind it, proof that the years of sacrifice had not been erased no matter how much they tried to rewrite them. I lay there until dawn with the papers spread across my lap, remembering how many times I had been asked to stay quiet for the sake of peace, to accept dismissal in the name of family harmony, to pretend not to notice when my contributions were repackaged as theirs. I thought of the times I had written checks from my account to cover their debts, the times I had agreed to co-sign, the times I had dipped into my savings so their children could attend summer camps and private schools, the times I had agreed to take, the smaller bedroom, the weaker chair, the back seat, always telling myself that love was measured by what one gave, not what one kept. And there, in the wake of the party that turned me into a pet for their amusement, I realized that the sum of all those sacrifices had not dissolved into nothing. They were preserved in those papers, silent but undeniable, waiting for the moment when I would need them most. The betrayal crystallized with brutal clarity. They had known all along that I still had a claim, that I still had standing, that I still mattered in ways they could not erase, and that was why they mocked me. Because mockery was easier than recognition, because if they could laugh at me, they would not have to reckon with the fact that I still held power. Their cruelty was not born of ignorance, but of fear disguised as contempt. They feared the day I would remember who I was, feared the day I would lift my voice, feared the day I would spread those papers on the polished table in front of their friends, and say, "No, it is not you who kept me. It was I who built this life you claim as your own." That night was not only the night of my humiliation, it was the night I remembered my leverage, the night I saw their fear hiding beneath their laughter. So the catalyst was simple in shape, but enormous in consequence. The collar they buckled on me made visible what had been festering for years, the reduction of my existence to dependency, the rewriting of my history into their narrative, the silencing of my voice into their laughter. But the papers I unfolded afterward reminded me that history does not vanish, that signatures remain, that sacrifices leave traces beyond memory. And once I had seen that, once I had felt the balance shift in my hands, there was no going back to silence. The laughter that night was cruel, but it became the spark that lit the recognition of my power, and recognition is the first step to reclamation. In the days that followed, the silence in the house did not feel like silence at all, but like a carefully rehearsed performance of indifference, a stage play in which my role was to drift quietly along the margins while decisions were made, conversations conducted and lives arranged without me. After the party, I was not mentioned, not even in passing, as though my humiliation had been absorbed into the walls and dismissed as unremarkable. They moved around me with the smooth efficiency of people who believed they had already explained everything and did not need to revisit it, people who assumed I would fall back into my accustomed role of quiet tolerance, people who knew from long practice that I would not raise my voice. My daughter-in-law treated me with exaggerated sweetness, offering cups of tea I did not want, praising me for folding a blanket neatly, speaking to me in a tone reserved for the very young or the very senile, all while refusing to meet my eyes. My son kept his distance, distracted with work emails and phone calls, answering me with half sentences, never acknowledging the heaviness that hung between us. The children were instructed to be polite, and so they offered clipped greetings and quick smiles before hurrying upstairs, their eyes flicking past me as though I were a coat rack or a vase that had always been in the corner but never deserved a second glance. It was in these days, more than on the night of the collar itself, that I felt the slow grinding erosion of my presence, the way one can feel the ocean eating away at a cliff, not with thunderous waves, but with endless repetition, a soft gnawing that leaves rock fragile and hollow. Meals were served with the same food to everyone, yet my plate was always the smallest portion, always the scraps of conversation. When neighbors came by, I was introduced with the same false smile and the same phrase, "This is Mary, Daniel's mother. She's staying with us for a while," as though I were a house guest who had overstayed my welcome, as though I were not the reason the house existed at all, as though the years of labor and sacrifice had been erased and replaced by the fiction that I had been taken in out of kindness. And I said nothing, not because I believed them, but because I understood that silence now was a gathering of strength, that to speak too soon would be to waste what I had, that I had to endure this escalation of contempt without betraying the knowledge I held in the brown envelope tucked safely inside my bag. At night I heard them speaking through the thin walls, voices carrying in hushed tones, not meant for me, but meant nonetheless to be overheard. They spoke of how forgetful I was becoming, how fragile, how difficult it would be for me to manage on my own, how perhaps it was time to consider arrangements, words spoken with feigned concern but laced with calculation. I understood then that the collar at the party had been only the most visible symbol of something deeper, the slow construction of a narrative in which I was not a woman with agency, but a burden to be managed, a liability to be controlled. They wanted to erase the record of what I had given, to paint me instead as someone who should be grateful for their attention, someone who owed them, someone who could be tucked away without consequence. Every sigh, every eye roll, every dismissal at the dinner table was another stitch in that narrative, tightening around me like thread pulled cruelly through cloth. I began to notice the small indignities more acutely. My chair at the table was shifted farther down, closer to the children, as though my voice could not be trusted among the adults. When I offered to help with dishes, I was told to sit, to rest, as if my hands had never known the feel of hot water or the weight of plates. When I asked about plans for the weekend, I was told vaguely, "Oh, nothing you need to worry about," as though the very act of curiosity was an intrusion. Even the television remote was kept out of reach, and when I asked once to watch the evening news, my daughter-in-law laughed lightly and said, "You can catch the highlights on your phone," though she knew as well as I did that my phone was an old model with a cracked screen, incapable of streaming anything, a relic she often mocked as outdated. It was a performance of care that disguised contempt, a theater of dismissal where every gesture was draped in politeness but sharpened underneath with exclusion. And yet, in their eagerness to control the narrative, they underestimated the quietness of my watchfulness. I listened when they thought I was not listening. I observed the tightening of their voices when bills arrived, the way they argued in whispers about money late at night, the tension that passed like a shiver between them when the subject of the mortgage came up. I saw the unopened envelopes piled near the desk, the way my son's jaw clenched when he thought no one was watching. They believed I was invisible, but invisibility grants a vantage point of its own. And from that vantage, I began to see the outlines of their fear, the fragile scaffolding of the life they had built on my silence. The escalation was not in dramatic outbursts or violent confrontations, but in the steady accretion of erasures. My history was erased each time they introduced me as a dependent guest, rather than the woman whose signature still lived on the deeds. My autonomy was erased each time they spoke of my fragility as though it were already fact, a justification for the control they sought to claim. My dignity was erased each time they smiled indulgently at my words, treating them as quaint relics rather than truths forged through decades of endurance. What had begun as a single evening's humiliation was stretching into a sustained campaign, a rewriting of my life while I still breathed. But the more they escalated, the steadier I became inside. I no longer believed that kindness would return, that understanding would bloom if only I remained patient. I understood instead that they were preparing the ground for a final dismissal, and that if I did not prepare my own ground, if I did not sharpen my own tools, I would be erased in full. So I waited, not as a victim waits, but as a witness gathers evidence, as someone who knows that silence can be a weapon if it is used carefully, if it is preserved until the precise moment. Each small exclusion, each laugh, each sigh became fuel, and each evening I opened the envelope again, smoothed the papers on my lap, and reminded myself that history, once written, cannot be erased by anyone's convenience. It was during those nights that I began to understand the difference between weakness and patience. They believed I was weak, that my silence was a sign of diminishing faculties, but in truth, my silence was a reservoir, a dam holding back a flood that would, when unleashed, sweep away the fragile structures of their deception. And as their dismissals grew more frequent, as their narrative hardened, so too did my resolve. The escalation was their mistake, because in seeking to make me smaller, they reminded me of the size I still possessed. The change did not come with thunder. It did not come with a slammed door or a shouted word, but with the slow realization one morning as I sat by the window of the guest room and watched the branches of a tree outside sway in the pale light that I had been waiting my entire life for someone to give me permission to stand. And now at 81 I finally understood that permission would never arrive, that no one would hand me back the dignity I had allowed them to strip away, that if I wanted to live even one day free of the leash they had buckled at my throat, I would have to unbuckle it myself. It was a quiet shift. But quiet does not mean small, because once the thought took hold, it spread through me like heat in winter. Thawing parts of me I had forgotten existed. I began to ask myself questions I had avoided for years. Why was I still here? Why had I allowed myself to be reduced to this role? Why had I given without pause until nothing of me was left but the assumption that I owed them every breath? I thought of the papers folded in the brown envelope, the proof that I was not as powerless as they wanted me to believe, and I thought of how strange it was that I had hidden them for so long as if I were ashamed of my own strength. That day, I left the house under the pretense of needing fresh air, and I walked farther than I had in months, my feet aching in shoes that were too old, my hip murmuring with every step. But I did not turn back. I walked past the manicured lawns and the shining cars, past the neighbors who looked at me with mild curiosity as though I were out of place in their tidy world, and I kept walking until I found myself at the public library, a building I had not entered in decades. Inside, the air smelled of paper and dust and quiet, and I felt something loosen in my chest. I asked for a computer terminal and sat down awkwardly before the glowing screen, my hands stiff on the keyboard, and I began to look up names of lawyers, financial advisors, even senior advocacy groups, and though my searching was clumsy and my eyes strained at the small print, I felt a spark of competence return. The memory of the woman who once balanced accounts late into the night, who once signed checks with confidence, who once believed she had the right to make choices. I wrote down numbers, I copied addresses, I folded the paper and tucked it into my purse with a care that felt almost ceremonial. It was not only about the lawyers or the papers, though. The shift was inside me, in the way I carried myself even as I returned to the house. I noticed that I no longer sat in the corner chair without protest. Instead, I chose the seat I wanted and let them frown if they wished. I no longer forced a smile when they made their subtle jokes. I let my face remain calm, unreadable, and I watched their unease grow in the silence. I no longer rushed to explain myself when I forgot something or moved slowly. I allowed the moment to hang without apology. And in that pause, I realized how much of my life had been spent apologizing for existing. The collar they had clasped at my throat had been removed physically that night, but symbolically it had remained, and now I began to feel it loosening with every choice I made, every refusal to play the part they had written for me. At night, instead of staring at the ceiling and replaying their laughter, I began to write. At first only a few sentences scribbled on a notepad I had brought with me, then longer passages, letters to myself, reminders of what I had endured and what I still carried. I wrote down the details of every bill I had paid for them, every loan I had co-signed, every sacrifice I had made, not because I needed the record for court, but because I needed it for me, because I needed to see in ink that I had not imagined my worth, that it was real, that it was measurable, that I had the right to demand recognition. The act of writing was small, but it was also reclamation. It was proof that my memory, my narrative, my truth were still intact, and that no amount of their condescension could erase it. The midpoint of my story was not a public confrontation, but a private awakening, the moment when I stopped waiting for justice to come from outside and began to see that it would have to come from within. I began to look at my son not as the boy I had raised, but as the man who had betrayed me, and in that recognition, I felt the first stirrings of detachment, the faint but liberating sense that I did not need to cling to him for meaning, that perhaps my life could still be mine even without his approval. I looked at my daughter-in-law and saw not a gatekeeper to belonging, but a frightened woman desperate to maintain control, a woman who needed me to be small because otherwise she would have to confront her own dependency on the very person she tried to erase. Seeing them clearly did not hurt less, but it changed the shape of the hurt. It was no longer bewildering, no longer a confusion I carried like a stone in my chest, but something sharper, cleaner, something I could act against. And so I began to plan, quietly, without haste. I gathered the papers. I copied numbers. I rehearsed words in my mind not of accusation, but of declaration. Words that would not beg or plead, but simply state, "This is mine. I am here. You cannot erase me." The fear that had once paralyzed me began to recede, replaced by a strange calm, the calm of someone who has lived through enough storms to know that surviving is not the same as living, and that it is not too late to choose life. It was a midpoint not of external drama, but of internal alignment, a turning of the wheel that set me on a path I had long avoided. The collar had been their symbol, but the papers were mine, and soon, very soon, I would learn how to use them. The past has a way of returning not with one loud knock, but with many soft taps, and I began to notice, once I had taken those first quiet steps toward reclaiming myself, that their pressure upon me grew stronger, as though they sensed some change in the air, as though they could smell the shift in my silence and feared what it might conceal. At first it was subtle, a suggestion from my daughter-in-law over breakfast that perhaps I should consider letting them manage my finances, just to make things easier, one less worry for you. She spoke with the softness of someone offering help, but beneath the words lay the unmistakable hunger of control, the desire to take what remained of my independence and fold it neatly into their hands. I declined with a smile that startled her, not a smile of confusion or submission, but one of clarity, and for a brief moment I saw her composure crack, the faint flicker of unease in her eyes, as she realized I was not quite as pliant as she had hoped. But that was only the beginning. My son soon followed with his own lines of pressure, carefully rehearsed phrases about protecting me and ensuring my future, all of them circling around the same demand: to grant him power of attorney, to hand over the keys to my life as though I had already lost the right to carry them. He couched it in the language of filial duty, but I heard the strain beneath his voice, the financial desperation he thought he had hidden, the debts that crept behind his polished appearance, the fear that if I ever chose to assert myself, the ground beneath his carefully built image would collapse. I listened to him patiently, nodding at the appropriate pauses, but inside I felt only a rising steadiness, a knowledge that this was their escalation, their attempt to tighten the leash once more because they feared I might slip it. The pressure grew heavier in small domestic ways. My access to information was quietly reduced. Bills no longer placed on the counter where I might see them, mail redirected, phone calls taken outside. My suggestions, when I offered them, were dismissed with polite laughter, and I began to notice that they spoke of me more often in the third person even while I was present, as though I were not a participant, but a subject. "She forgets things," my daughter-in-law would murmur with false sympathy. "She doesn't need to be bothered with that," my son would add. They were writing me out of my own life in real time, rehearsing the story they would tell others, a story in which I was fragile, incapable, dependent. And yet, their performance betrayed its own weakness, because it was too loud, too insistent, the way a lie often is when those who tell it must convince themselves first. It was during this time that a letter arrived from my grandson, the one soul among them who had never treated me as invisible, the only one whose eyes had ever met mine with warmth rather than calculation. His words were simple, handwritten on lined paper, asking if I was well, telling me he missed me, confiding that his parents were worried, though, in a way that carried more duty than sincerity. I read that letter 3 times before folding it carefully and slipping it into the same envelope that held the deeds and the legal documents, as if by keeping them together, I could preserve both proof of my history and proof of my future. One a shield, the other a seed. His voice reminded me that not all blood is poisoned, that not all generations inherit cruelty, and that knowledge strengthened me in ways the papers alone could not. But the family, sensing my quiet resistance, did not relent. They escalated further, staging conversations for me to overhear, conversations about nursing homes and assisted living facilities, spoken in tones of false reluctance, as if the idea pained them when in truth it thrilled them. They spoke of how much easier it would be, how I would have companionship, how professionals would care for me properly, as though love and history had no weight compared to efficiency and control. I sat in silence as they spoke, sipping my tea, but I wrote every word down later in my notebook, every phrase, every attempt to cast exile as kindness, because I understood that they were preparing the narrative to justify my removal, to make me vanish from the house I had built while preserving their reputation as dutiful children. Their performance extended beyond the walls of the house. I discovered, quite by accident, a newspaper clipping left on the counter, an article in which my son was quoted speaking of his devotion to his family, his sacrifices, his achievements, the home he had built for them with years of hard work. Not one mention of me, Not one acknowledgement of the truth that without my signature and my savings, the foundation would never have been laid. He was rewriting history for an audience, just as he tried to rewrite it for me, and the realization made my resolve sharpen into something almost metallic, a blade honed by contempt. They were preparing to erase me not only from the present but from the past, and if I did not act, if I did not claim my place, then the story of my life would be buried under their lies. I began to prepare more deliberately. I contacted one of the numbers I had written down at the library, a lawyer whose voice on the phone was brisk but not unkind, and I arranged to meet her under the pretext of running errands. I sat in her office with my papers spread before me, my hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of long-suppressed truth. And I watched as she read through the documents, her brow furrowing, her eyes widening slightly. "You still hold majority ownership," she said, her voice calm but edged with surprise. "They cannot remove you. They cannot sell without your consent. You have far more authority here than they realize." Her words were not new. I had known this in some quiet part of myself, but hearing them spoken aloud, confirmed, stamped with legal certainty, was like feeling the collar snap open at last. I left her office with copies of everything, neatly bound, tucked into a folder that felt heavier than stone, not because of its weight, but because of the power it contained. And still the escalation continued. My daughter-in-law confronted me one evening, her voice sharp behind the sweetness, telling me that my presence in the house was becoming difficult, that I made the children uneasy, that my forgetfulness was becoming dangerous. She smiled as she said it, but her hands trembled, betraying her fear, and I realized then that she knew, at least in part, that the narrative they had built was crumbling. My son tried to intervene, but even his words were laced with panic now, the panic of a man who realizes that the story he tells about himself is built on borrowed ground. I listened, I nodded, I did not argue, but inside I felt a quiet triumph, because their cruelty had revealed its source. They were afraid. The second escalation was not about humiliation alone. It was about pressure, manipulation, the attempt to strip away what remained of my independence before I could assert it. They thought they could tighten the leash once more, that by speaking of nursing homes and fragility and legal guardianship, they could frighten me into compliance. But instead, every attempt only reminded me of the strength I still carried. Every word of dismissal only fueled my determination. Every staged conversation only confirmed what I already knew, that I was standing at the edge of a choice, and that soon I would have to step forward. The collar had been their symbol, the papers were mine, and now the clash between the two was inevitable. So the pressure grew, and with it my clarity. I no longer feared their laughter. I no longer mistook their silence for peace. I saw them now for what they were, actors in a play of control, clinging to a stage that belonged to me. And though they did not know it yet, though they still believed they could bend me to their will, I was already preparing the moment when I would walk onto that stage, lay down my papers, and speak in a voice they had long forgotten I possessed. That would be the moment of no return, the moment when their escalation met mine, and only one of us would leave with power intact. The day of the gathering arrived not by coincidence, but by design, because they had invited friends and colleagues once more into the house to celebrate another of my son's supposed accomplishments, another promotion, another step upward in the image he had built for himself. And I knew that this was the moment, that no quieter stage would serve, that the humiliation they had once inflicted on me in public demanded to be answered in public, that if I was to reclaim my name, it must be done where their laughter had been loudest. I dressed with care that morning, not in the faded navy dress I had worn before, but in a garment I had purchased in secret with the small money I had kept aside, a deep burgundy fabric that fell heavy and strong against my body, a color that demanded attention, a color no one could mistake for meekness. I pinned my hair neatly, I polished the shoes that had grown dull, and I slipped the folder of papers into my bag, along with the collar they had once clasped at my throat, because I knew that symbols carry power only if one dares to wield them. When I entered the house, the noise struck me at once. The mingling of voices, the clatter of glasses, the sheen of performance, all of it a mask for the unease that ran beneath their smiles. My son greeted me with a kiss on the cheek. Too swift, too formal, his eyes darting as if to check that I was not carrying trouble. My daughter-in-law's smile was stretched thin, her voice pitched higher than usual, as though cheerfulness could smother tension. They guided me toward the corner seat again, but I did not move where they pointed. I walked instead to the center table and sat down, placing my bag at my side. The guests watched without comment, polite confusion flickering in their glances, but I felt no tremor of fear. The time for fear had ended. The evening unfolded in its usual rhythm, toasts raised, anecdotes told, my son basking in the admiration of those who believed his story, and all the while I sat silent, waiting for the moment to arrive. It came when he began to speak of the home, the pride of his labor, the gift he had given his family, and I knew then that the hour had struck, that the performance had reached the same point it had on the night of my humiliation, and that now I must step into the light. I reached into my bag, not hurried, not hesitant, but with the calm certainty of someone who knows the weight of her own hand, and I laid the folder upon the polished wood of the table. The sound was not loud, but it carried, a thud that silenced the room more effectively than any shout. I opened it slowly, letting the papers fan out. Deeds, contracts, signatures, the trail of ink that bound the house and its walls to my name. My son's voice faltered. My daughter-in-law's hand froze around her glass, and the guests leaned closer, curiosity sharpening the air. I spoke then, not loudly, but with a clarity that carried to every corner of the room. I told them the truth, that the house they admired had been built on my credit, my savings, my signature, that the stability they envied was not his alone but mine first, that I had been written out of their story, but that the ink of my name had never faded, that it remained stronger than their pretense, stronger than their laughter. I said these things not as accusation but as declaration, and in my voice was no tremor, only the steadiness of a woman who had at last stepped back into her rightful place. Then I reached once more into my bag and drew out the collar, the very same they had fastened around my neck as a joke, the leather still carrying the faint smell of humiliation, and I laid it gently atop the pile of papers. The room drew in breath as one, a sound like the ocean recoiling. I looked directly at my son, then at his wife, and I said, "This is what you gave me. This is how you chose to mark me, and now I give it back. It belongs to you, not to me. What belongs to me is this house, this name, this life. Do not forget it again." My words were quiet, but in the silence that followed they rang like bells. For a moment no one moved. My son's face was pale, his lips parted but no sound escaping, his carefully built image cracking in the eyes of his guests. My daughter-in-law tried to laugh, a thin, brittle sound, but it died in her throat when no one joined her. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes, others staring openly, caught between the loyalty of social ties and the undeniable truth laid bare before them. I gathered the papers calmly, sliding them back into the folder, leaving only the collar upon the table, as if it were a relic of a time now ended. Then I stood, straightening my shoulders, and I said the final words I had carried inside me for months. "You may tell whatever stories you like, but the truth is written, and I am no one's pet. I am the owner of this house, and I choose where I belong." I did not wait for their responses. I did not care whether they argued, whether they denied, whether they scrambled to explain to their guests. I walked from the room with the folder in my hands, and the silence of their shame trailing behind me. Outside the night was cool, the air sharp against my skin, and as I breathed it in, I felt something inside me loosen at last, the weight of years of silence lifting, the collar gone from my throat forever. It was not victory in the sense they might have imagined, not triumph with banners and applause, but something deeper, something more enduring, the reclamation of my voice, the return of my name, the quiet, unshakable truth that could never again be erased. That was the climax, not the explosion of anger or the collapse of bonds, but the steady, irreversible moment when I placed their cruelty beside my truth and made them see the difference, when I returned their gift of humiliation and reclaimed the tsays, inheritance of my labor, when I stopped being the invisible woman in the corner and became once more the author of my own story. And once done, it could not be undone. When I left that house for the last time, I did not look back. The night air wrapped itself around me like an unseen shawl, cool and steady, and each step I took toward the waiting taxi felt like stepping not into exile but into release. I carried the folder on my lap during the ride, my fingers resting on its cover as though it were a living thing, a companion that had waited patiently through the long years of silence, and I thought how strange it was that power can exist in such an ordinary form, just paper and ink, yet it can steady the spine of a woman who has been bent too long beneath the weight of other people's stories. When I arrived at the modest flat above the bakery, the one I had rented quietly in preparation, I climbed the stairs slowly but with a sense of ceremony, because this was not just a set of rooms, but the threshold of a life I had reclaimed. The space was small, the ceiling low, the furniture sparse, but it was mine, and when I opened the window, the smell of bread rising from the ovens below greeted me like a hymn. I placed the folder in the drawer of my desk, locked it, and set the key on the chain around my neck, where no one could remove it without my consent. The collar they had once fastened upon me I hung in the closet, not hidden, not discarded, but displayed as a relic, a reminder of what I had endured and what I had refused to become. It does not shame me to see it now. Instead, it reminds me that cruelty leaves marks only if we accept them as permanent, and that an object of humiliation can be turned into a symbol of survival when it is reclaimed by the one who bore it. In the days that followed, there were calls, there were letters, there were attempts to draw me back into their orbit, but I answered none of them. I did not need to shout or to explain. Silence itself became my boundary, and for the first time it was not a silence of fear but of choice. My lawyer confirmed that the deeds were secure, that no move could be made without my consent, and with that knowledge I felt no urgency to fight further. I had already done what was necessary. I had spoken aloud the truth they had denied. I had laid bare their fear in front of witnesses, and I had stepped away with my dignity intact. What remained was not vengeance, but peace, a quieter kind of triumph that requires no audience. I began to fill my days with small rituals of freedom. I walked each morning to the park and sat on a bench to watch the children play. Not my grandchildren, but children nonetheless, their laughter untainted by cruelty, their voices reminding me that joy need not always be at someone else's expense. I learned the names of the bakers below, a young couple who treated me with courtesy but not condescension, who asked me once to taste a new recipe and listened sincerely to my opinion. I visited the library again, not to search in desperation but to read, to remember the pleasure of words unchained from necessity. I even began to write more seriously, filling notebooks with memories, with reflections, with pieces of myself that had been silenced for too long, as though putting them on paper gave them back to me. Sometimes in the quiet of evening, I allow myself to think of my son, of the boy he once was, and the man he became. There is sorrow in that reflection, sorrow that no confrontation can erase. But there is also acceptance. I cannot undo his choices. I cannot rewrite the years of betrayal. But I can refuse to let them define me. I carry the love I once gave him not as a wound, but as proof of my capacity. And I no longer ask for return. He chose silence when I needed his voice, and that silence is his to live with. Mine is a different silence now, one that guards my peace rather than erases me. If I speak at all, it is not to him, but to women like me. Women who have given until nothing seems to remain. Women who have been told that gratitude is the only language they are allowed to speak. Women who have been laughed at when they try to protest, who have been diminished until they begin to forget the size they once carried. To those women I say, do not wait for them to see you, because they may never choose to. Do not wait for them to give you permission, because they will not. Search instead for what remains in your hands, whether it is paper or memory, or the simple stubbornness of your own voice, and hold it until the day you are ready to place it on the table and say, "This is mine. I am here. I will not vanish." Do not mistake endurance for emptiness, and do not mistake silence for defeat. I am 81 years old, and I live now in a modest flat above a bakery. Each morning the smell of bread greets me. Each evening I lock my door with the certainty that it is mine. And in that simple rhythm I have found more freedom than I ever had in the larger house where my name was spoken only in mockery. The collar remains in my closet. The papers remain in my drawer. But they are no longer heavy with threat. They are simply reminders, one of what was done to me, the other of what I still carry. And when I look at them, I do not feel bitterness. I feel peace, because I know that I did not leave the house collared. I left it carrying my own name, and that is enough.